The rumble of drums, the tramping of thousands of feet, the smell of tar and scorching iron. This is how a siege began, one that could last not days but months. In the ancient world, a fortress was not merely a wall and towers, it was a challenge to an entire army. Polybius wrote that the Romans rarely left things half-finished. If they surrounded a city, they prepared either to wipe it off the face of the earth or to turn it into part of their empire. But here's the main question. How exactly did they take those walls that seemed impregnable? And what was their most terrible weapon? Rams and ladders? Or the iron discipline of man? The answer lies deeper, and by the end of this story we'll approach a discovery that will make everyone think about their own endurance. Before deploying an assault, the Romans conducted what can be called an operation of complete bleeding out of the enemy. They cut off roads, burned fields, and blocked water supply. Appian noted, the main goal was not only to physically weaken the defenders, but also to morally exhaust them. War turned into waiting, long, grueling, where each day behind the walls became torture. Enormous mounds of earth and stone grew at the walls like artificial hills. These mounds were called ager. Essentially, these were temporary roads leading directly to the enemy's towers. Imagine a hill the height of a 5-story building that day by day advanced on your walls. The Roman legions were in no hurry. They turned the very terrain into a weapon. To command such actions, a legate was appointed, a trusted person of the commander. The legate didn't simply give orders, he kept the entire picture of the siege in mind. Who was digging ditches? Who was guarding the formation? Who was preparing the machines? His task, not to let a single cog of the enormous military machine stop. Archaeological excavations in Numantia, a Spanish fortress besieged by the Romans in the 2nd century BC, revealed the remains of these earthen ramparts. Stones piled into enormous mounds lie there even today, as a silent monument to the systematic pressure that turned proud defense into silence. But walls are only the beginning. The real drama of siegecraft lay not in iron, but in how the Romans turned every little thing into a weapon. Even hunger, even silence. When supplies ran out behind the fortress walls, each day became a needle in the heart of the defenders, and outside, the legionaries stood silently, building camps with geometric precision as if time itself worked for them. And here a question arises. Is it possible to defeat an enemy almost without raising a sword? Or was everything decided by that minute when the Romans went at the walls in their famous living armor? The answer lies in the tactics we will see in the next episode of this siege. When the walls still held, the Romans moved to the second phase, preparation for assault. This was not a chaotic collection of random actions. Everything was built on strict calculation and discipline. Plutarch wrote, Rome's strength lay not only in the bravery of its warriors, but also in their ability to prepare victory. The army transformed into an engineering corps, where each soldier knew how to dig a trench, erect a tower, or haul heavy beams for battering rams. One of the main tools were enormous wooden towers that gradually moved closer to the walls. These mobile fortresses were called turis. Imagine a multi-story behemoth on wheels, covered with fresh animal hides to protect it from fire. Inside stood ballistae, firing stone projectiles, and from above archers released a hail of arrows. For the defenders, it was like seeing an approaching house full of death, moving slowly but relentlessly. To bring such machines closer to the fortress, legionaries built platforms and embankments. Work went on day and night. A centurion ensured that each century of soldiers fulfilled their quota. If a man slacked off, punishment was immediate. Discipline here was more important than strength. The lives of those in the tower depended on how evenly the logs and stones were laid. The Romans knew, before striking head-on, you must exhaust the opponent. For this, they erected continuous lines of fortifications around the fortress. These fortifications were called circumvallation. Imagine a city that found itself in a cage. No way out, no provisions to get, help from outside cannot break through. This was a closed circle, and the longer it tightened, the faster the spirit of the defenders broke. Excavations near Alesia in France, where Julius Caesar surrounded the forces of Vercingetorix, revealed the remains of these lines. Trenches, embankments, remains of palisades. Archaeologists even found sharpened stakes with which the Romans studied the ground so the enemy could not break through. All this confirms the Romans prepared victory the way a chess player builds a trap dozens of moves ahead. The rations of the warriors were also part of this strategy. Legionaries ate mainly wheat, from which they prepared porridge or flatbreads, as well as beans and meat, if it was in the supply train. The daily grain ration was about 1 kilogram. This supply soldiers often carried themselves. Together with weapons and armor, the weight could reach 40 kilograms. Think about it, the assault army was also an army of porters who moved together with their siege machine. For coordinating actions, signals were used. Trumpets, horns, banners. A tribune, one of the senior officers, was responsible for the orderly transmission of these signals. In the chaos of construction and preparation, it was he who turned noise into a controlled symphony. One trumpet sound, and thousands of people knew it was time to dig. Another, that they needed to line up to guard the works. But all this preparation had another side. Behind the fortress walls, residents heard the rumble of hammers, the crack of logs, the hum of wheels. This was the sound of slowly approaching doom. No randomness, only step by step the advancing war machine. And it was precisely this silence, interspersed with the rumble of siege machines, that broke the spirit of the defenders faster than arrows. Thus a scene was created where every detail was calculated. The ground beneath the enemy's feet turned into a weapon, their food into weakness, their hope for help into emptiness. But the storm itself was only just gathering. At the moment when the towers moved in close, the real hell began, where rams thundered and walls collapsed. The strike against the walls began not suddenly, but like the long-awaited final chord of an enormous symphony. When the embankments were brought up, the towers ready, the encirclement lines closed. Then the main weapon came into play, battering rams. These monstrous beams with iron tips the Romans called aris. The word itself meant ram, because with their strike they truly resembled a powerful blow with horns. The defenders knew if an aris stood by the wall, then each minute could be the last for their city. To cover the ram, the Romans erected special wooden shelters on wheels covered with wet hides. These mobile canopies were called testudine arietes. Under them dozens of men swung a heavy beam and with rhythmic blows crashed into the masonry. The sound was more terrible than the destruction itself, a dull, rolling thunder as if the earth itself shuddered. For the defenders this was a signal of the end. But the main image that ancient authors remembered was the tortoise. The battle formation of legionaries, when warriors closed their shields overhead and on the sides, was called testudo. From the outside, it looked like an enormous living armor, under which men moved forward slowly, but unstoppably. Archers on the walls released arrow after arrow, rolled down burning logs and stones, but arrows bounced off, and fire died on the shields. Under such a roof, soldiers moved ladders up to the walls or covered engineers working at the base. It was precisely this living armor that became the symbol of Roman training. Polybius wrote, "No people could compare with the Romans in their ability to use collective effort. Each warrior was not an individual but part of a mechanism." Think about it. You stand in cramped quarters in armor weighing 20 kilograms, with a shield another 10 or so. Above you, tar is pouring and stones are flying. And all that is required of you. Not to flinch, not to raise your head, not to break formation. This is precisely what legionaries endured. The defenders tried to respond. They built wooden canopies over the walls, a kind of visor to knock down ladders, poured boiling water and oil. Some sources mention even the use of burning tar. But against discipline, this often proved ineffective. The Romans prepared wet hides for protection in advance, sand for extinguishing fire, tools for undermining. Another element of assault. Roman sappers, who were called fossores, dug passages under the walls to collapse the towers. They propped up the vaults with wooden beams, doused them with tar and set them on fire. When the beams burned through, the walls settled and cracked. Appian described how entire sections of fortifications fell from such actions, opening a breach for attack. All these elements were coordinated by the commander on the ground, a centurion. He was in the very thick of events, alongside his men. His task was simple and terrible at the same time: to lead forward even if half the soldiers around had already died. In the Roman army, a centurion was more than an officer. This was a man who by personal example showed what it meant to go all the way. The assault was like a compressed spring. Weeks of silence and preparation were replaced by a sudden explosion. Trumpets thundered, rams rumbled, ladders rose to the sky. For the defenders, this was the moment when each second decided the fate of the city. For the attackers, when months of labor could turn into either triumph or defeat. And so in such a hellish symphony, the main miracle of the Roman war machine occurred. Thousands of men acted as one organism. There was no chaos, no panic, only rhythm. Blows following one after another, until the walls began to tremble and crumble. But even the fall of the wall did not yet mean victory. The most terrible thing always waited inside, when the assault turned into street fighting. When a breach appeared in the wall, the bloodiest ordeal began. Outside, the battle was noise and iron, but inside the fortress it turned into chaos, where each house became a bastion. Tacitus wrote, "Street fighting for the Romans was harder than any battlefield. Here cavalry didn't work. It was difficult to use formation, and the enemy fought desperately because behind his back remained families and sanctuary." Heavy infantry rushed first into the breaches. These warriors with rectangular shields and short gladius swords formed tight ranks, and step by step advanced through the streets. Strikes were short, aimed under the ribs or at the face. The main rule of the gladius, not swing but precision. Polybius noted, the Roman sword was created not for beautiful duels, but for dirty and quick work at arm's length. Here the experience of centurions became especially important. Each centurion led about 80 soldiers into battle. His shout, his shield gesture, set the tempo of movement. When the street was narrow, the centurion arranged his men in a wedge to break through a concentration of the enemy. When space widened, he divided the detachment into two parts and squeezed the defenders in pincers. This can be compared to a modern coach who manages a team on the field. Only lives were at stake, and a mistake meant the death of dozens of people. Archaeologists in Jerusalem found traces of such battles from the time of the siege of 70 AD. Remains of burned houses, layers of collapsed masonry, arrowheads and ballista bolts. These finds show that the urban fabric was literally ground into ash and ruins. Each building became a new wall, each street intersection a new battlefield. To suppress resistance, the Romans applied yet another tactic. They set up scorpions on the streets, small throwing machines that fired long bolts. Such weapons pierced right through even several people. They were called in Latin scorpio, because the strike resembled a deadly sting. These machines were placed right in the breaches, and from there they combed the streets, weakening the defense before the infantry's advance. An important role was played by tribunes, senior officers who coordinated several hundred or even thousands of soldiers. They didn't burst into the first line, but it was they who determined where to cut through a new street with a ram, where to set fire to wooden houses to deprive the enemy of cover, where to block the road for the retreating. Their work was cold and calculated, like a strategy game, only the pieces were living people. The noise of battle inside the fortress was described by ancient authors as a hellish mixture: the grinding of swords, the clang of shields, the screams of the dying, the roar of trumpets. To this was added the smell of burning tar and wood, ash that settled on faces. For a modern person, this can be compared to footage of destroyed quarters in disaster films. But then there was no cinema, only reality, in which each street resembled ruins after an earthquake. For legionaries, this was a moment of supreme tension. No discipline could fully protect against the chaos of street fighting. Therefore, simple but effective signals were in use. A raised banner meant hold formation. The sound of a horn, move forward. Even in smoke and darkness, these signals gave order where chaos reigned. And yet, despite the cruelty and blood, for the Romans the street assault was a necessary stage, proving not only their military might, but also their fortitude of spirit. When a city fell, the next, even more dramatic part began. The decision of what to do with the defeated: wipe them off the face of the earth, or turn them into subjects of Rome. And this decision became the true denouement of the entire siege. When the walls collapsed and street fighting came to an end, the Romans faced the main question: what to do with the city? There was no single rule here. Livy wrote that the fate of the besieged depended on the will of the commander and on how long and stubbornly they resisted. Sometimes residents were spared and turned into allies, sometimes sold into slavery, and sometimes the city was wiped off the face of the earth, so that it would become a lesson for the rest. One of the most striking examples was the Carthaginian War. In 146 BC, after a 3-year siege, the Romans burst into Carthage. Appian described that for 6 days street fighting went on. Each house became a fortress, and the defenders fought to the last. On the 7th day, the city was taken, and then a terrible decision followed. Carthage was burned, and its inhabitants, about 50,000 people, were sold into slavery. This act became a symbol of Roman ruthlessness. But the outcome was not always like that. Julius Caesar, besieging Alesia in 52 BC, acted differently. After the Gauls surrendered from hunger, he spared the city but executed its leader Vercingetorix in Rome. Thus, the Romans showed that they were ready to spare those who submitted but never forgave those who challenged them. An important role at this stage was played by the prefect of the camp, an officer who was responsible for order and distribution of spoils. After the fall of the city, it was he who ensured that property was divided according to established norms. Each soldier received his share, but a significant portion of the riches went to the treasury and for the triumph of the commander. For legionaries, this was a material incentive, the knowledge that for long months of hunger and labor they would receive a reward. Archaeological findings confirm the scale of destruction. In the layers of Carthage and Corinth, burned by the Romans, archaeologists find thick layers of ash and charred wood. In some places, collapsed walls preserved traces of the most powerful fire, which could blaze for weeks. This was not simply a military action, but a symbolic destruction of the memory of the city. But along with cruelty, there existed another motive. The Romans knew how to use fear. Rumors of how Carthage was turned to ash spread faster than any army, and the mere mention of Roman siege machines could force a small city to open its gates without a fight. Thus, cruel examples worked as a weapon of future victories. And yet each siege had its own price. Soldiers died not only from the sword, but also from disease, hunger, and exhausting work. Polybius noted, often the losses of attackers during sieges were no less than those of the defenders. Winter sieges became especially difficult. Cold, dampness, lack of food broke men just as much as enemy blows. Here the special strength of the Roman army manifested itself, the ability to endure hardships. Each legionary was obliged to carry not only weapons, but also equipment for the camp, stakes for the palisade, a cauldron, grain. The weight of his burden could reach 45 kilograms. It was not by chance that legionaries were called Marius's mules, for the fact that they carried half the army on themselves. Thus the terrible arithmetic of siege took shape. Tens of thousands of men, months of labor, thousands of dead, for the sake of one wall, one city, one victory. But this arithmetic made sense. Each taken city strengthened the Roman Empire, made it not simply stronger, but a terrifying force that no one wanted to challenge. However, the final question always remained unchanged. How far can a man go for the sake of victory? And where does the line run between discipline and cruelty, between valor and destruction? The finale of any Roman siege was not only a military victory, but also an act of political theater. A city that fell became a symbol. Its fate turned into a lesson for neighbors and for soldiers, into proof of their endurance and strength. Plutarch wrote, "No people could hold a siege as long and stubbornly as the Romans. Their secret was not in one weapon or technique, but in the combination of engineering, discipline, and iron will." The main principle lay in the fact that a siege was not a spontaneous outburst, but a carefully calculated machine. Caesar in his notes emphasized, the success of a siege was built on constant pressure, where the enemy had to surrender even before swords touched his skin. The Romans mastered the art of taking a city before battle, forcing the enemy to capitulate under the weight of hunger and hopelessness. This was not only a military, but also a psychological assault. The symbol of such pressure became the lines of fortifications that stretched for dozens of kilometers. Alesia was surrounded by ramparts more than 15 kilometers long, and behind them another ring against the relief army. Imagine a city clamped in stone vise, where every meter of earth around was dug up, studded with stakes and fortified. This is not simply war, but the creation of a new landscape, the transformation of nature into a weapon. But behind all this engineering stood a simple man, a legionary who day after day dug, built, hauled logs and stones on himself. His body wore out, straps chafed his shoulders, his back ached from the weight. Tacitus wrote that a Roman soldier during a siege was no less a builder than a warrior, and this is precisely what made him stronger. He was accustomed to labor, accustomed to endure. The final scene of a siege always had a human face. It could be a city engulfed in flames, or a procession of captives led out to the commander. Archaeologists in Judea found stone inscriptions with the names of Roman units that left their marks on the ruins of destroyed fortifications. This was a kind of autograph of history. We were here, and the city fell. But behind each such act stood a question that does not lose its force even today. If the Romans could hold a city in a ring for months, could break the most desperate walls with hunger and iron, then what allowed them not to break themselves? The answer is simple and terrible. Collective discipline. Each soldier knew that his life belonged not to him, but to the legion and to Rome. Modern military historians, such as Goldsworthy and Keegan, note, it was precisely in sieges that the essence of Roman strategy manifested itself. Here the army's ability to live and win in a long, exhausting struggle was tested. A quick battle could be a matter of chance, but a siege showed who was stronger in will. And so we return to the question that sounded at the beginning. What was the main weapon of the Romans? Rams and towers or iron discipline? The answer is obvious. Iron breaks, wood burns, walls collapse. But the spirit that allowed a man in armor weighing 20 kilograms to go under a rain of arrows and stones without flinching, that is the true weapon of Rome. And now, knowing this story, everyone can ask themselves, could I endure even one day in such a formation, under the rumble of rams and the cries of enemies? Could I dig a trench not knowing if I would see tomorrow's sun? What remains in us, modern people, of that fortitude that turned simple farmers into conquerors of the world? Roman sieges changed the course of history. They destroyed Carthage, crushed the cities of Greece, subjugated Gaul and Judea. But their main legacy is a lesson. Empires are built not only by the sword, but also by patience, labor and iron will. Archaeologists still find traces of these camps, trenches and burnt walls, and historians continue to debate what was more important, technique or spirit. And each time we see the ruins of an ancient city, it's worth remembering. Romans once stood there. They were not heroes in shining armor as in movies. They were ordinary people who, step by step, blow by blow, proved that human endurance is capable of breaking even stone. And the question that remains for us, if fate depended on us, would we have enough of that very will that helped Rome take impregnable fortresses?